I'd like to begin this episode with actually a little experiment, so humor me, if you will. Let's start by putting the back of our hand about 3 inches from our mouths. Now, go ahead and do that. Now, purse your lips and blow some air onto the back of your hand. Note how it feels. There's nothing very complicated about this. It should probably feel pretty cool or cold against the back of your hand. Now, let's switch the shape of our mouths, relax your lips, widen your mouth, and blow some more air onto the back of your hand. You'll notice, I hope, that blowing on your hand with an open mouth feels actually quite different from when you do it with pursed lips. The first should feel cool, and the second should feel warm. Now, this might be kind of a weird way to begin this episode, but keep this little experiment in mind as we move forward. Because in this episode, we're going to witness a presocratic philosopher that takes this phenomenon of blowing on the back of your hand with pursed lips versus with an open mouth as evidence that everything, yes, everything, is air that has just been modified in some way. Yes, indeed, Anaximenes, the philosopher of interest in this episode, maintains that every element is just air that has been heated up or rarefied or cooled down or condensed. Now, the past few episodes have dealt squarely with Anaximenes' Milesian predecessors, Thales and Anaximander. With Thales, we witnessed the first documented, at least, natural philosopher of the West, and we saw him hypothesize that all elements depend on or derive their being from water, a kind of natural first principle of everything else. According to this explanatory model, a wide array of phenomena can be explained in virtue of the fact that elements derive their being from water. Anaximander, however, which we discussed last episode, came along and suggested that Thales may have gotten something wrong. Specifically, Anaximander supposes that the first principle of the world would need to be something that is indefinite or boundless, a kind of primordial stuff that we never actually interact with directly, through which finite or definite things can come into being. This boundless stuff is never actually experienced, as I just noted, but it is what makes everything that we experience possible. So, in this episode, we're going to be witnessing a third option, which kind of strikes a balance between Thales' proposal that one of the four elements is prior to the others, and Anaximander's proposal that the first principle of the world has to be something that's boundless or indefinite. This third option is found in Anaximenes' suggestion that the first principle of everything is indeed air. Air, he supposes, contains enough dynamisy to explain the emergence of the other derivative elements in a way that water does not. But it also has this sort of indefiniteness about it insofar as we can't see it in the same way that we can see other elements. So let's just go ahead now and jump in for another episode of Ideas Through Time. I thought it might be helpful to begin this episode with a brief overview, actually, of some of the technical terms that we're going to be using in it. The primary goal of this podcast is to introduce the wonderful world of the history of philosophy to public audiences, or audiences outside of the actual academic discipline of the history of philosophy. And given this, the last thing that I'd want to do is present these podcast episodes in a way that isn't welcoming to those who are less familiar with these terms. You'll notice, though, that these terms don't really, most of the time, express concepts that we're unfamiliar with. They do sometimes, but most of the time they don't. They just allow us to talk in more precise ways about philosophical topics. So let's go ahead and attend to those specific terms. The first is one that we've come across multiple times now, called metaphysics. This term refers to claims that we make about the nature of reality itself. This is one of the primary branches of philosophy and will be a term that is used regularly throughout the duration of this podcast, beyond just this episode. Now, one particular study within metaphysics is something called ontology. another term that we have come across multiple times in previous episodes. Ontology refers to the study of being. Ontological questions include questions like, what exists? If we answered this question by saying only material things exist, something that we could call materialism, we'd be making a claim about the set of existing things. And that set would exclude things like immaterial minds or souls or an immaterial God. But ontology is also interested in questions about the relation between existing things or things that we suppose to exist. We saw this in our last episode when we talked about something called ontological priority. That which is ontologically prior to something else in some way makes those other things, which depend upon it, possible. For instance, as I mentioned in the last episode, the banana is ontologically prior to its yellowness. We know this because the banana can be green or brown, as it is earlier or later in its life. It's not essential to the banana itself to be yellow. And in this sense, the banana exists or can exist in a sense prior to its non-essential properties, like its color, for instance. Another term that is important that we'll come across quite a bit is epistemology. This term relates to theories about knowledge, how we acquire knowledge, how we know when we know something, or how do we know that we genuinely have knowledge? What is the nature of justification and how does it relate to knowledge? Things like this. So whenever I use the term epistemology, or whenever you use the term epistemology, you'll be referring to theories that have to do with the nature of our knowledge. Lastly, and perhaps most importantly for this episode, I want to go over the term deductive arguments. This is the last term that is important to have some sense of moving forward. And in fact, it'll be the most important term for the beginning, at least, of today's discussion. So let's start with the term argument. In philosophy, an argument isn't referring to a heated discussion between, say, a married couple that ends with hurt feelings, nor is it referring to a squabble between a couple of kids over their favorite toy or anything like that. In philosophy, the term argument refers to a set of true or false statements or sentences that logically support a conclusion, which is another statement or sentence that's either true or false. These supporting statements that are either true or false are called premises. And so an argument in philosophy will always consist of a set or list of premises, true or false statements or sentences, that infer or support a conclusion, which is just another true or false statement. So perhaps an example would be helpful here. Let's say that I want to provide an argument for the conclusion that the ground is wet outside. I don't know why that's my example, but let's just run with it. Notice that this claim that the ground is wet outside is either true or false. As a matter of fact, the ground outside is either wet or it is not. But in order to defend this claim, I might use the following set of premises or true or false statements to support it. First, I could say, if it is raining outside, then the ground is wet. This would be the first premise. The second premise could be, it is indeed raining outside, and thus it would follow from these statements, if they're both true, that the ground indeed is wet outside. So the argument would go, if it is raining outside, then the ground outside is wet. It is indeed raining outside, therefore the ground outside is wet. This is a very simple version of a philosophical argument called modus ponens, a set of premises, supporting statements, that is, that logically support the conclusion. Now, let's say that someone disagrees with my conclusion. It turns out that philosophical arguments can be evaluated, and the activity of evaluating arguments is really the lifeblood of contemporary philosophy. There are, of course, other ways to be philosophically engaged aside from just critiquing philosophical arguments, but this is probably one of the main ways to engage philosophically. It's to critique and critically engage with the arguments that people give in support of their philosophical conclusions. And so, one way to critique a philosophical argument is to attack the truth of an argument's premises or supporting statements. Notice in our example that so long as the premises are true, namely, first, that the statement, if it is raining outside, then the ground outside is wet, if that's true, and if the statement that it is indeed raining outside, if both of those things are true, then the conclusion that the ground is wet outside naturally and logically has to follow. So we can attack this argument or deny the conclusion of this argument by denying the truth of either of the premises, because the truth of the conclusion depends upon the truth and logical structure of the premises. So I could say that it is not actually raining outside, deny the second premise. And if I did that, then, and it were true that it is indeed not raining outside, then it wouldn't follow that the ground outside is actually wet. The conclusion would no longer follow from the set of premises because one of the premises would be false. Or I could argue that the ground outside is actually covered by an outdoor tent. And so even if it were raining outside, even if the second premise were true, the claim that if it is raining outside, then the ground is wet would be false because it's covered by a tent. We could attack then either or both of the premises, and it would show that we are not obligated, epistemically obligated, to accept the conclusion. Now, all along, I've been discussing, whether you're aware of it or not, deductive arguments. A deductive argument, which is the term that I'm introducing this episode, is one kind of argument among many others. A deductive argument is deductive insofar as the conclusion to the argument naturally or logically follows with necessity from the premises. That is, if the premises are true, then the conclusion has to follow. It's most often contrasted with something called inductive or probabilistic arguments, which only establish the probability of a conclusion. They don't yield certainty, per se, in the same way that deductive arguments do. So these comments on logical inference will actually be helpful for our discussion today. Why, you might ask? Because Anaximander, the character we attended to in the last episode, actually has an argument, specifically a deductive argument for his view that the first principle of everything must be boundless or indefinite stuff. And Anaximenes takes issue with this argument, leading to his own unique proposal. So we have a proposed argument, deductive argument from Anaximander, and we have Anaximenes disagreeing with at least one of the premises in Anaximander's argument. This is indicative of a philosophical debate, perhaps the first philosophical debate that's recorded in Western history, at least. So let's set the stage just a little bit more. Over the past few episodes, we have been attending to the first natural philosophers of the West, especially Thales and Anaximander. These philosophers were primarily reacting to the mythological foundations of Greek thought. Hesiod's mythology was founded on epistemically irresponsible grounds, as we saw a couple episodes ago, presumably given to him by unreliable muses who claimed to say both true and false things. The earliest Greek philosophers then sought to move away from these mythological explanations that aren't particularly reliable and replace them with naturalistic ones. Thales suggests that the origins of the universe can be found in water, a determinate element that can modulate and change into different elements, allegedly. Anaximander, in response to Thales, takes a more abstract, philosophical, or, as we saw, rationalist approach. He proposes that the first principle of the universe is a boundless or indefinite stuff. But why? Why does he accept this conclusion or propose this as a solution? What actually is the argument that Anaximander provides for this conclusion? Here, I rely on David Rushnick's own recapitulation or reconstruction of the argument. According to his reading, Anaximander makes the following claims. This is an argument. Premise 1. If X is a determinate thing, then it is finite. Premise 2. If X is finite, then it comes into being and passes away. Premise 3. The first principle of everything neither comes into being nor passes away. And therefore, our conclusion, the first principle is indefinite. Okay, so we have three premises that support a conclusion. This argument is logically valid insofar as if the premises are true, then the conclusion has to follow. So if we were to attack this argument, we would have to deny the truth of at least one of the premises. Now, you may notice some similarities, actually, between our example argument from earlier about the ground being wet outside and the argument that Anaximander is making. Though it's not super important, it follows a logical form that's actually intimately related to modus ponens, the form of the argument we saw earlier. It's kind of the counterpart, if you will, to modus ponens, actually. It's called modus tollens, or the argument from denying the consequent. In short, Anaximander is pointing out that if something is definite, it comes into being and it passes away. The first principle can't possess this property because it is the thing through which all finite things are made possible. And so the first principle can't be a definite thing. It has to be not definite, or as we might put it, it must be indefinite. This is a logically valid deductive argument. That is, if the supporting premises or statements are indeed true, then the conclusion has to follow. And if this is the case, then Anaximander has kind of put us in a tough spot. If we disagree with him, we'll have to come up with principled reasons for supposing that at least one of his premises is false. And this is exactly what Anaximenes, his successor, actually does. So it indicates a philosophical debate between the two of them. Now, in the last episode, I suggested that Anaximander's boundless first principle sounded a lot like chaos, actually. The first principle, or origin of the universe in Greek mythology. Recall, in Hesiod's Greek mythology, chaos is the thing through which all other things are created. And so if Anaximander's boundless first principle sounds like a chaotic thing, then he might be falling in line with Greek mythology, just giving it in naturalistic terms. And Rishnik seems to actually agree with this reading, it seems, so I guess I wasn't too far off. Go me. As Rishnik points out, Anaximenes may have looked at Anaximander's position and thought, no, we can't have a fully indefinite or boundless stuff as the first principle of the universe. An indefinite thing can't be fully captured by our thought. It can't be a concept that we fully grasp. After all, it's boundless, it's indefinite, it's indeterminate. It's something that we can't fully conceptualize or think about. So this intuition, I think, is what drives Anaximenes to deny at least one of Anaximander's premises. In this case, Anaximenes would be limited to denying premise 1, I think, which suggests that if a thing is definite, then it must be finite. This premise allows Anaximander to draw a connection between definiteness and finitude, or being finite, obviously. But if Anaximenes can disrupt this connection, then he can escape the force of Anaximander's argument, which relies on claiming that the first principle can't possess properties that indicate that something is finite. Indeed, Anaximenes suggests that air is the first principle of the world. However, air, according to Anaximenes, is quantitatively indefinite but qualitatively definite. That is, it is the same kind of stuff, that is airy stuff, but it is boundless. And its quality is the least definite of all of the different elemental qualities from, say, fire or water or earth. After all, air is not perceived by the senses, though all of the other elements are. And so air represents a kind of middle ground for Anaximenes between Thales' suggestion that a specific element, namely water, is the first principle, and Anaximander's suggestion that no specific element, that is the boundless, is the first principle. Anaximenes proposes that the least definite element can serve as the first principle while avoiding being identified as finite. So, definiteness does not imply finitude for Anaximenes. And if this is the case, then Anaximenes' argument fails because it insufficiently links definiteness to passing away and coming into being. It seems that the first principle does not, after all, have to be fully indefinite or qualitatively and quantitatively boundless. It can be quantitatively boundless while remaining qualitatively bound. So Anaximenes escapes Anaximander' argument. But what is the model that he himself proposes in its stead? Anaximenes makes some really interesting metaphysical developments in the history of philosophy. That is, developments in his theory about the nature of reality. Specifically, in supposing that air is the first principle, he additionally thinks that air can qualitatively modify and change given quantitative changes or alterations. We can understand this concept better if we return to the little experiment from the introduction to this episode. I told you it would come in handy later on. Recall the difference you experienced when blowing air on the back of your hand. If you blow on the back of your hand with pursed lips, it'll feel cool on your skin. But if you blow with an open mouth, it'll feel warm. What about the shape of our mouth? What about it affects the perceived temperature of the air? After all, it's the same breath, it's the same kind of stuff that's coming out, but it is clearly experienced differently. Anaximenes notices this and finds it to be evidence that quantitative changes can actually yield qualitative modifications. When we alter the shape of our mouth, Anaximenes notices that we condense or rarefy the air that is actually blown through our lips. What do I mean by this? Well, when we purse our lips and blow air, we actually condense it or make the air that's passing through our lips more dense. In this case, according to Anaximenes, we feel a greater degree of cool air. But when we open our mouth and blow air, we rarefy the air or make it less dense. And in so doing, we feel a greater degree of warm air. Now, if we were to take this observation and generalize it, and suppose that the dynamic temperature of air could get even hotter and hotter, or cooler and cooler, and hence more and more rarefied or more and more condensed, then Anaximenes thinks that the qualities that air has might change more and more. Indeed, Anaximenes suggests that it undergoes radical change. When air gets so rarefied and its heat increases so dramatically, he thinks that it actually transforms into another element called fire. But when it condenses, even just a little, it becomes wind, and then when it condenses more, it can become water. Think, for instance, here about when you kind of blow your breath on glass, water droplets might appear, right? So there's some empirical evidence, if you don't know what's actually going on there scientifically, to suggest that air can transform into water. And then if it condenses even further, Anaximenes thinks it can actually become earth and then stone. So from air, Anaximenes thinks he can account for the origin of all the other elements. We just need air and some conditions for it to modify. Quantitative changes, that is, things like density and rarefaction, are sufficient, Anaximenes thinks, to account for all of the other elements. Of course, there are some observations that could fly in the face of Anaximenes' model. For instance, why is it that when we blow on glass with an open mouth, when air is meant to be more rarefied and hot, do we get water condensation, which is supposed to happen when air condenses? Or why, when we blow on a fire with pursed lips that condenses the air and makes it cooler, do we get a stronger flame? These examples seem to conflict, I think, with Anaximenes' intuitions. Could he have accounted for them? Perhaps. Again, we don't have much textual evidence for his actual reasons for supposing that air is the first principle. But to get the most out of our historical studies, we don't actually need to be very critical of these figures. We can be charitable and interpret them and remember that we're working with very limited textual data, especially this far back in history. We're talking like 2,500 years here, so that's quite a long time. Now, Anaximenes didn't just hold these metaphysical views, which were really interesting contributions for his time. He actually leveraged them to develop an explanatory model of the universe. Precisely how these two connect is not immediately clear, his metaphysics and his explanatory model, again, because of limited texts. But we do know some things about Anaximander's cosmology. Recall that Anaximander thought that the Earth was a snare drum-shaped body that floated in indefinite space. This was a really big step forward in cosmological models for his time. But Anaximenes comes after him, vehemently disagreed with Anaximander's model. The Earth stands fixed, Anaximenes thinks, supported only by air, which is a particular element. And he thinks that the heavenly bodies don't actually rotate or travel underneath the Earth, but instead around the fixed Earth, fixed flat Earth. I have some friends from my old church in Philadelphia, shout out to Jeff, that would go to this Russian bathhouse in New Jersey, the Southampton Spa. He would tell me how the saunas actually ran so hot that they would give you these felt caps to wear so that you wouldn't burn your head, and it would also, I guess, help you sweat more. If you live in the greater Philly area, be sure to go. It's one of the things I actually regret not doing before moving back to the West Coast. Anyway, though, Anaximenes thought that heavenly bodies rotated around the Earth in the same way that a felt cap, just like the ones found at Southampton Spa, I swear I'm not sponsored by them, could be kind of like spun around or rotated on your head. I know it's kind of a weird example, but I hope it helps make a little bit of sense of Anaximenes' model. After all, the felt cap example is actually literally used by Anaximenes himself. So while Anaximenes represents some important shifts in metaphysics and ontology, his natural science, at least to our modern eyes, might be lacking. And at least by my own lights, it doesn't come across as compelling or as creative as Anaximander's. Nonetheless, the main takeaways we should have from the Milesian presocratics is this notion of explanatory models. We are all given experiences of the world. Just look around. The world is presented to us in so many different and interesting ways. Pens drop to the floor when you let go of them. Colors help us distinguish between different objects. Our experience is spatially and temporally structured, and so much more. Our experience of the world is rich, and it's diverse, and it yields a host of different phenomena. So as curious humans, we see in the presocratics an attempt to begin to explain our experience of the world in naturalistic and exhaustive ways. They offer naturalistic explanatory models insofar as they don't appeal to supernatural sources of information, and they are exhaustive insofar as they aim to explain as much phenomena as possible. Of course, in practice, they were far from exhaustive, but they were surely aiming for it. So that's cool. What's more, they don't merely explain, but as seen especially in Anaximander, these figures actually justify their explanations with arguments. So we have in the presocratics, at least the Milesians, although it only gets more nuanced from here, we have in the presocratics explanatory models with justification. This is a significant epistemological leap. That is a leap in our theories of knowledge. Now, all our conversation about the presocratics has so far dealt heavily with metaphysics and epistemology, and some of you may be listening and thinking, who cares? Who gives a rip? Why does it matter what people think about such abstract things as first principles of the cosmos? One way to answer this question appeals to a later philosopher, one who is actually quite near and dear to my heart, René Descartes, a figure that I worked on for my dissertation for my doctoral program. In the preface to his work, Principles of Philosophy, Descartes likens philosophy to a tree. He tells us that the roots of the tree are metaphysics, and then the trunk of the tree is physics, and the branches and fruits of the tree are medicine, mechanics, and morals. The very nutrients, then, that are required to make developments in those final three subjects, medicine, mechanics, and morals, depend upon the tree being planted in a healthy soil so that through its metaphysics and physics, we can collect and transport the appropriate nutrients to grow those other disciplines. So why do these metaphysical and epistemological projects matter? Because the kinds of metaphysical systems we develop influence our lived experience. They influence the way we think about other people. They influence the way we think about the nature of the world around us and our relation to it. They might influence the way that we think about God or divine entities, or for atheists out there, perhaps the lack thereof, and much more. And the way that we think about these different things will certainly influence the way that we engage with the world. We'll see this more and more the more we dig into the history of philosophy. So I encourage you to stay the course and continue digging into this important study. Now, all that said, I've decided that the next episodes of this podcast are actually going to step aside from the presocratics for a moment to try out a special Across Time series on political philosophy. We in the United States are preparing for an important chapter with a presidential election quickly approaching. I thought it would be nice to step back from our Through Time series, which tracks the development of history, the history of philosophy in chronological order for the time being, and instead jump into a historical survey of something called the social contract theory and look at its adherents like Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, and also its critics like John Stuart Mill, Marx, and Charles Mills. After spending some time on these figures, spending some time on political philosophy, we'll then return to the presocratics and pick up where we left off, jumping into philosophers like Pythagoras, Xenophanes, and Heraclitus, or, other presocratics. So I hope that you all have a wonderful week, and I'll see you next time for more on ideas through time. Until next time, bye.